All right, well, we want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I just wanted to officially welcome everyone today to today's webinar. I'm Alton Dillard, a communications advisor for the elections group. I spent 17 years as a communications professional for the Denver County Clerk and Recorder, and prior to that served as a press secretary in the United States Senate during the Bush v. Gore days. So I go way back when it comes to elections administration, elections communication, and looking forward just to having a nice chat and sharing some tips from my experience, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end for plenty of questions. So before we get started, I do want to mention that the Q&A feature will be on for participants to be able to ask questions during that portion, and we want to get to as many questions as we can. So a little bit about the elections group. The elections group is an election consulting organization. We partner with state and local elections officials to implement new programs and also help improve processes for voters and stakeholders. We provide a variety of guidance, resources, tools, and even direct management support for jurisdictions. And our team's made up of former election officials from all across the United States. We've got folks from different political parties, people who are elected, people who are appointed, staff level people like me. You can find out more information about the elections group using the link to our website, which we will make sure goes up in the chat. So I'm going to start off talking a little bit about our communications resource desk. We are now open for 2024. Who'd have thunk? We are already in the thick of the election year, and we're just about 3 weeks into the month of January. So as you see, the Communications Resource Desk offers a variety of resources, everything from social media graphics, reference posters, pocket guides, little one-pagers, templates, and more. And one of the things we're going to talk about a lot today is the importance of templates, because when you're in the thick of an election, taking time to create content can sometimes take you away from your mission. So we're going to talk about some communications planning tips, and these tips are like in no particular order, and it's not meant to be an exhaustive list, because remember, here at the elections group, we're going to continue to host a variety of conversations throughout the year. And so all the resources shared during this call will also be shared with election officials on the call. And so after the thing concludes, we'll be able just to have you connect. So just sit back and take notes. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, so make sure you're tuning into the elections group over the course of 2024 and beyond. So tip number 1, be proactive. You really want to make sure to get out in front of the wave, especially in today's election environment. So it's so much easier to get out front and to anticipate, and you're already here, so you're being proactive. So good job to all of our visitors and guests. Tip number 2, you also want to make sure, be aware of your capacity. As we know, elections are a 50-state patchwork. So you have jurisdictions that, like my former jurisdiction, very well resourced, large communications team, large community outreach team, but we know not everyone is resourced that way. So one of the things that is always going to help is if you make sure to have a dedicated communications person. And the reason you want to do that is you don't want to take a lot of time away from the administration of the actual election when you're trying to communicate externally to the public. So as I mentioned, as we go along, we're going to talk about some tricks of the trade to make sure that you have the resources and the tools already in your toolbox. So when you need them, you just have to reach over and grab one, as opposed to creating one from scratch. Another thing to keep in mind with capacity is social media presence. It's very good to be on social media, but you truly have to be 10 toes in. A lot of governmental entities treat social media like a website, a static place just to put information. Social media is actually a two-way communications tool. So you have to ask yourself, do we have the capacity to engage in the dialogue in the public square? Do we have someone who's available if misinformation pops up at 2 a.m.? You can't let it sit there until you arrive at your office at 8 a.m. without getting out in front of it. So you have to ask yourself, am I resourced enough to be able to have a social media presence? But please make sure you're doing something. Not being able to do it at all is a pretty poor excuse for doing nothing. So you want to do something, but just be mindful of your capacity when doing so. Next tip, one of my favorites, work with the media. Review your media contact list and make sure it is up to date. And don't be like Alton, who carried his around in his mind. And then it's like, well, where's the media list? And it's like, well, I just know all these people. So actually make sure that you do a list, whether it be, a Google Doc or a Excel spreadsheet, something that has name, email, phone number. It also is handy to have a column to track the most recent coverage, just so you make sure those reporters are still out there. Another thing you may want to do, especially with it being January, is to consider hosting an open house or some other way of being able to show that you're ramping up, that you're gearing up, but also that you are a part of your community. So think in terms of establishing relationships with the members of your local media. Now, using Denver as an example, where I worked for those 17 years, Denver is a top 20 media market. The last time I checked, I think it's like the 16th media market in the nation. So because of that, you get reporters who are new to the market, but then also because it's a top 20 market, people I've worked with over my time in the business have launched to CNN, they've launched to Fox, they've launched to MSNBC. And so there's always a constant turnover. And I always used to joke with the folks in the newsroom that, of course, election day is short straw duty because their reporters had to be seeing my pretty face at 4 a.m. on election day. And so you always want to make sure you have that constant communication so you know who is still in town, who may have left town, who may have covered you for the past 2 years, who may have a successor that just showed up in town. Another thing to do, have media tours. And this is if your jurisdiction allows tours. One of the things that I've always found fascinating, using the United Kingdom as an example, media and cameras are not allowed in their polling places or their vote processing centers. And that was, if you'll pardon the pun, sort of a totally foreign concept to me, because that was always such a part of transparency that helps bring us out of the proverbial black box. Another thing that's handy is making sure that you have a dedicated person on your team responsible for speaking to the media. So if you're a small organization, it may be you yourself, it may be your elections director if you don't have a PIO. But if you do have a PIO, make sure that person is at the table at all times to know what's going on. There's nothing worse as a professional communicator than finding out something that was going on internally from an external source. So a good example of how to really work with the media, we like to always talk about Craig Latimer in Hillsborough County. They do a really good job of just, here's what a quote unquote slow year looks like in an elections office is a classic example. Because how many times have you all gotten the question, Well, what do you do between elections? There's always been this myth that elections officials ramp it up for like 2 days out of the year, then we hang upside down like vampire bats the other 11 months out of the year. And we all know that's not the case. You've got elections, everything from our upcoming presidential down to sanitation and water districts. There's always perpetual preparation going on. And then also remember, here at the elections group, we do have a media guide resource that you can use to fill in with the information from your jurisdiction. And as I mentioned earlier, having that at the handy. Next tip, you always want to be as transparent as possible with the opportunities for observation in mind. So the elections group had actually hosted a conversation with Orange County's Registrar of Voters, Bob Page, and then a former colleague of mine, who's now the Lane County, Oregon clerk and recorder, Dina Dawson, and they talked about their efforts to enhance opportunities for observation in their respective offices. And the thing with observation, again, understanding that it's the 50-state patchwork of elections, there's always ways to do it, but you have to evolve sort of with the times. Some jurisdictions provide the transparency by having watchers. My old jurisdiction had 2 levels of watchers who could be in the room, and then another level that was credentialed higher, so they would actually be able to see PII. So they're the ones who could be over judges' shoulders during processes, and then always made sure that we had someone available at the SME level who was able to answer questions. And so we also have several customizable templates at the elections group. And again, we're going to keep talking about the importance of templates because, again, when you're in the thick of election, content creation on the fly actually almost introduces an unnecessary element of risk. Tip number 5, another one of my favorites, put a human face on the administration of elections. Seeing so many jurisdictions that have gotten so good at this over these past couple of years. Because of the elections environment and some of the vitriol and everything, one of the things that really helps tamp it down is just show that the people working in this process are members of your community. There are grandmothers, there are aunts, there are veterans, there are people who are such integral parts of the fabric of our community, and they're just trying to do their part to provide smooth elections and be part of the democratic process. So it shows that we're not a faceless bureaucracy nor a black box. And when we get to the crisis communications part, we'll talk about the importance of not hunkering down. But find stories and anecdotes to share that show that we are human beings. And this is one of those things that, again, comes sort of down to personal choice. So you see these examples from some of the Wisconsin clerks. One of the things that's happened because of the current narrative is not everyone is comfortable appearing on camera or in videos or in social media posts or having, their images and names floating around out there. So that is sort of a matter of personal preference from the elected or appointed level on down. But anything you can do that, even if you have people who don't want to be highlighted, you still have to be creative in highlighting the work. So we have a guide that is titled Telling Our Story. That is another one of our elections group resources that you can use for that purpose. Tip number 6, avoid technical jargon and be conversational. And, again, we all have worked in government and we have all been guilty of it, because that's the thing that's so cool about sectors, and especially about the elections sector, is we have our own lexicon and we're so used to communicating it internally. RLAs, LATs, things like that. But when you're communicating externally, make sure that you're being descriptive and whenever possible, use the entire term. A risk limiting audit, a logic and accuracy test, a simple term like voting system test, just to be able to let people know that you are checking out your processes from A to Z. And then you can always take the wonkier deep dive with the reporters and stuff to make sure that they're using the information properly also. Tip number 7, never, never, never too early for crisis communications planning. What usually makes a normal situation turn into a crisis is lack of planning. So there are a few keys here, but the number one is know who your crisis communications team is and have that in place long before any election. This is your go team. This is your strike team. These are the people that if something goes wrong, you have to be able to gather together to triage to determine if it is an actual crisis. And one of the things that I always caution, because I had a career in media prior to becoming a spokesperson and a press secretary, negative press does not always equal a crisis. And that's why those reporter and media relationships that we talked about are so important. So as you see, we also have a tool called 5 Steps for Creating a Crisis Communications Plan, and we will be updating that for the 2024 election year, but another example of some of the materials that are out there. But again, I want to keep harping on the fact that negative media is sometimes going to happen. And going back to why it's so important to put a human face on the conduct of elections, stuff happens. There is just, it's an undeniable fact. And one of the things I love about the world of elections administration is how we're able to learn from one another and use things that happen as examples and lessons learned. But I've never seen a vibe or a feel of trying to throw colleagues under the bus. They're just simple, teachable moments because stuff happens, because this is a human process. So my old jurisdiction, we serve almost 500,000 voters. And so that's a lot of paper, that's a lot of ballots, that's a lot of vote centers. Things are going to happen. All right, so tip number 8, and this goes back to the importance of using templates and making sure to have materials at the ready in advance. So again, when everything starts going around you and the media is knocking at your door and the councilman or the alderman or the mayor or the county commissioners are like, hey, we're hearing A, B, and C, have your material ready in advance. And so another bit that you'll see in our toolkit here at the elections group is that, there's all kinds of letterheads, press release templates, social media graphics, etc., that you can have. The other thing that's very important is making sure that you have pocket statements. Pocket statements are just short little statements that you have ready so you don't have to create them on the fly. So there are 2 examples of types of pocket statements. There's the kind that you can do just to prepare for any potential contingency. So again, think of that human factor that we talk about. So for things that are just, sometimes going to happen, there's a typo, something doesn't appear, where it should on a ballot, a power outage, a polling place goes, offline, or because perhaps people don't understand that elections aren't like they were 20 years ago, where you simply plugged an 8-track looking thing into a tabulator and got instantaneous results. And so people think something's wrong because they're not seeing real-time updates. You can prepare for that by having pocket statements at the ready. But pocket statements also come in handy as things pop up during the day. And I want to be 100% clear here. We're not talking about being opaque or non-transparent, but not everything that happens in the course of a human process like elections administration means that it's necessarily something that has to go out publicly. Sometimes there are things that can go a little haywire, but you're able to fix it because you were proactive. You know, an example that I remember from just, working in Colorado was a misprint that meant that a very small segment of voters in a contained geographic area got a wrong ballot style. But because we were able to proactively reach out to those voters, it did not blow up into a big, oh, there's fraud, something's wrong with the system, blah, blah, blah. It was just a matter of being able to say, oops, that was our mess up. And so one of the things also that pocket statements allow you to do is to turn the discussion towards solution, so you're not always dwelling in the problem. And so part of tip number 9 coming up goes back to that, is the importance of having relationships with offices and your external agencies and partners. So in my former jurisdiction, we actually had a group that we would use as our external eyes and ears. Because again, even in a well-resourced jurisdiction like Denver, you can't be everywhere. And so we always made sure heading into election that we had communication with everybody and made sure that we knew who to communicate with if something that was adjacent to election administration, but not necessarily a part of the day-to-day occurred. So everything from making sure that you can track down your USPS representative 24 hours a day, making sure you have a back channel to your ballot printer, making sure that you're able to say, hey, something, we noticed an issue, making sure that you've got someone that you can chat to there. Make sure you know someone at your public works department. It has been known to happen that you may get a pipe burst somewhere, a sewage issue somewhere that may take one of your voting locations offline. But you're not the expert in sewage. You're not the expert in plumbing. And so you need to make sure that you're in communication with someone who can authoritatively say, oh, we had a crack here in this water main or whatever. We expect to have it fixed in the next 3 hours. And then from the elections communications part, you're able to say, okay, we expect this center to be back online approximately 11 a.m. We will let you know when it is back up and running. You also want to make sure that you are being able to share the information, kind of in a personal way, because again, human processes. So it's election morning. Your judges start showing up at 6 a.m. The person with the key to the rec center didn't show up, and your election judges do not have the key. Do you know who to call at Parks and Rec to make sure that you're able to get in there, get through all your pre-election, pre-flight checklist, so you're able to accommodate voters at open of polls at 7 a.m.? That's another example of why it's so important to be able to get out there, out ahead of that. So again, I had 17 years working at the Denver Clerk and Recorder's office, and I want to give you a little bit of background before we really take the deeper dive into, why it's just so important to communicate with voters and sort of thread a few things together here. Back in 2006, back when we were still a commission structure with an appointed clerk and recorder and then 2 elected commissioners, we had a tech failure that resulted in 20,000 voters getting turned away without voting. And I'm talking, it was one of those situations where the news helicopters were up over our vote center showing the blocks long lines. And so there was a coming together as a city saying that can never happen again. And so that happened in November, and then in January of the following year, which would have been 2007, there was another election held to move to an elected clerk and recorder to create a central point of accountability, and that has been a very successful model. But it also provided opportunities to learn, and it also provided opportunities to show the importance of making sure your external stakeholders are in the loop, that your media is in the loop, and then anytime things go wrong, and trust me, that went wrong on a major scale. We must have been counting ballots for 3 weeks, but still being able to illustrate to the public that we're on it, we're working on it, our bad, but let us get through this election, get these votes counted, and then we'll work with, whomever to make sure it never happens again. And we have had successful elections ever since. Tip 10, keep your ear to the ground, especially in today's environment. This is another very key point, because you cannot simply just tune out narrative that you may not agree with. And see, especially in the social media area, that's why it's important to make sure that you've got people, if you're going to dabble in social media, who can keep an eye on the narrative. Because as I mentioned before, if somebody puts out something that is factually incorrect and they put it out at 10 p.m., but no one flips on your social until 8 a.m., it's a little harder to unring the bell. So make sure that you know what's being said about your jurisdiction, both on the positive and negative. Make sure if you have a media monitoring service that you scour that. Make sure you have Google alerts set up that mention your elected, probably elect your elections director, the name of your jurisdiction. Use Election Line to see what's going on, but also see what's going on around the country. Tip 11, we are in some modern times with this AI stuff. This is a totally new frontier. But remember, for the most part, a lot of this information gets combed from websites. So it's important to keep your websites up to date. So, and again, I understand this is not an issue of non-transparency or anything like that, but in order to keep your website up to date, it's always a good practice that once you put an election to bed, get through your final tally, get through your post-election processes, get through your final election process when your results become official. It's always beneficial to hold on to that information, but flip it into more of an archive so you can start to preview the next election. And then that way you're not looking up and your UOCAVA ballots are going out, one of my favorite acronyms, by the way, and you're like, oops, we haven't updated the website for our upcoming municipal, our upcoming county commissioner election or something like that. So again, we have no idea really, because AI is such a new world, on how it's going to be used, but you really want to make sure to keep those websites updated. And so, and one more point on that when it comes to updating the website is also just the importance. The other reason you want to keep your website updated, because you don't want external parties who are trying to be helpful. I'm a big fan of the hashtag don't help. Have them link to your information. All it takes is a League of Women Voters or a political party or something who, for instance, doesn't understand, like in a jurisdiction like the one I used to work for, that our in-person voting came together in phases because we were data-driven. And so we would always open up our office a week before any other locations. But all it takes is a well-meaning external partner putting on their website that early voting starts on October 22nd, and that may not be the case citywide. And then you have to try to run and pull that information back. So that's also why it's so important to keep your website up to date and say to your TV stations, your radio stations, your external partners, whomever it may be, instead of creating your own elections information content, we have everything that you need right here on our website. All right, so we're a little over 30 minutes here, so let's see if we have any questions for our Q&A. And I always like to joke, I'm a bit of a techno klutz, so I'll need a little bit of guidance to know if we have any questions that are ready to be answered. All right, so no questions so far. So let's do this. If there's anything that anyone wants to share that is not in the form of a question, an experience that you had, a lesson learned, a lesson that you would like to share from your jurisdiction. And I'll pause for a second to see if anything pops up for us here. And then if there are none, and if everyone is getting ready to get busy for this upcoming election, then what I will do is just thank everyone for their time, send you all a lot of wishes for what is going to be a busy year. We understand that elections professionals are busy. We understand that it is thankless work, but we also understand that it is very vital work. So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we do have a communications resource desk, and there's the QR code for you if you want to scan that. As we also talked about, again, we understand there are different levels of resourcing that take place in election offices. You have everywhere from large counties serving 1 million voters down to one where you may have 3 people in your offices doing elections, motor vehicle, and marriage license. So please rely on the elections group as a resource. We have all kinds of information at that communications resource desk. And we also are going to be in contact with everybody as we go along. So please, again, continue to follow our socials. Also, please check out our website. There's plenty of information there. And we wish everybody successful, smooth waters in this upcoming 2024 election cycle.